It is Monday, April 23rd, 2018, and this is 3000 NFL Mock Draft. And because it's Monday, the 23rd, that means that we are just, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Yeah, I'm pretty sure on my fingers that it's 3 days away from the 2018 NFL Draft. And with that draft, the Browns picking number 1, the Seahawks picking at number 18. Other things happening as well besides those two things. And here on 3000 NFL Mock Draft, of course, we're going to cover the spectrum as much as possible with a focus on the Seattle Seahawks. Although, the Seahawks, maybe only the Rams have currently less intrigue on days 1 and 2 than the Seahawks do. But that could change and should change perhaps by Thursday. By the time the Seahawks would be on the clock at pick 18, very likely to trade down, and we'll talk about that today with Rob Staton of SeahawksDraftBlog.com as usual, and we'll talk about many other things. And so it's just 3 days away. We've talked about the draft for months and months and months, as we do every single year, and it's just such a fascinating year. But just focusing on the Seahawks to start things out, because they're sitting there at pick 18 right now. All the speculation in the world that the Seattle Seahawks will trade down because they don't have a pick on day 2. They don't have a second or third round pick, and they're only picking at 18. And the real cream of the crop here seems to be in round 2 and round 3. So for the Seahawks, moving down seems inevitable. But sometimes, Rob, I think to myself, well, what if they don't trade down? What if this isn't one? What if this is just not the year when they decide to do it? Or 2, what if they don't get an offer to move down that they like? And Rob, for me, I just keep thinking to myself, every single team, all 31 other teams in the NFL know, based on track record, that the Seahawks are probably going to be willing to move down, and that, that makes me believe that if the Seahawks are still on the clock when pick 18 comes up, they will have 5 or 6 offers and they'll be able to move down. I think because teams will see themselves in a position to say, well, I'm at pick 26 and there's pick 18 and there's that one guy that I want. And so let me try offering a 4th round pick and see what happens. And I think the Seahawks ultimately will take the best offer. When you look at this trade down scenario for the Seattle Seahawks, do you call it 100%? Do you call it inevitable? Do you say this is a year where maybe it's more 50-50? What are you seeing with a trade down for the Seahawks?
Well, I don't think it's 100%, but it's probably 99% likely that they will trade down. And there's 2 things sort of working in Seattle's favor here in terms of moving down. And I think the first one is that, unlike veteran trades, if you try and trade for a veteran, for example, it really comes down to how willing you are to deal the player. So in the case of Marcus Peters with Kansas City, they couldn't really generate a market for him because they wanted to move him. And then the other team is what they're willing to offer. And that dictates the value of the trade. With draft picks, it's different. And although there's various different versions of the draft trade value chart these days, there's basically a framework there. So if you're moving, for example, from 33 up to number 18, there's a guide for what it's going to realistically cost. And you don't really find teams getting fleeced on trades. There's pretty much a stated framework there. So the teams that are thinking of moving up already know kind of what it's going to cost them. They've probably had the conversations with Seattle at the Combine or since then as to, listen, we've got a few options here that if a certain player goes to 18, we'll be willing to move up and we'll do a deal with you if you're interested. And how interested are you in doing this? And they can basically set things up well ahead of time. So that's one thing. And the other thing is that Seattle are sitting in a position at 18. And I don't think it's so much Dallas and Detroit at 19 and 20 that teams will want to leapfrog. But it's more about, if you want an offensive tackle, and there will be teams who need offensive tackles. New England are one that come to mind. Cleveland are another one. They've both lost very experienced, established left tackles in free agency and haven't replaced them. If you want one of the 2 that are going to go in the first round, that's Mike McGlinchey and Colton Miller, you're not going to be able to hang around. New England probably can't wait to number 23 to have one of these tackles there. They're going to have to move up a few spots. Cleveland have got no chance of waiting to number 33 and one of these guys being there. They're going to have to move up. And how bold do you want to be? And then the other thing is that what if someone like Lamar Jackson's there at number 18 and you're a team like Denver, for example, as Tony Pauline has projected in his latest mock draft, who wants to move up and get Lamar Jackson, wants to be really bold and make that kind of a move there. then you're going to guarantee him inside the top 20. You're not sort of waiting until the 20s there, or even the early 30s or whatever to make your move. You're saying, this is our guy. We want to go up and get him. We're going to be bold. So I think the Seahawks will get some interesting offers there, and ultimately they will trade down. I don't see any reason to stay at number 18. I see people like Vita Vea being mocked at number 17, 18, and he's not going to get anywhere near the Seahawks at number 18. He's just too good. People talk about Derwin James. I think he's a little bit overrated, might be off the board anyway. I just don't see the player. I think Harold Landry's a bit of a mirage. People talk him up a lot. He's not Vic Beasley. He's not Bruce Irvin. I don't think he's someone that you feel like you have to take there. Marcus Davenport has got a lot of talent, but is he the type of character fit that the Seahawks want? I'm not saying he's a bad character. He's just not an alpha. And if you're taking a pass rusher at 18, you kind of want him to be an alpha, and you want him to come into that team and be a real leader and a real vocal presence, and he just isn't that as well, and he's very raw. So I think everything's stacked up to trade down for the Seahawks. The value in this draft is going to be round 2, round 3. The guy that you take at 18 is probably going to be graded the same as the guy at 40 anyway. So move down, and they will.
And Rob, what are you hearing in the rumors as we lead into the last few days before the draft? I mean, you can take rumors as far as you want to take them. There's so many things that can get floating around that don't mean anything. And it may not even be intentionally trying to misdirect or smokescreen. I hate terms like smokescreen. I think people just say them to sound like, not that I'm saying that smokescreens don't exist or that it's not fair to call something a smokescreen. It just feels like a lot of the times that people use terminology like that, it's when someone just wants to deny that something could be true or whatever, or that there's always a little bit more conspiracy to NFL news or any news. I mean, hey guys, hashtag fake news. But there's some sort of more conspiracy to something rather than it just being like, oh yeah, maybe they did talk to that player. Oh yeah, maybe they are having discussions about taking a running back or whatever. There's always some sort of smoke screen. But in terms of the rumors surrounding the Seattle Seahawks, any connections to players that they may or may not have on their radar, or trades, or just anything of note that you're noticing up to the draft? And do you find it common that the final week rumors do play any sort of part on actual what happens on draft day?
I think it really depends on the source. For example, if you've got a good source there, reliable source, someone like Tony Pauline, again, to mention him at Draft Analyst a year ago, it was around about this time, a few days before the draft, that he was saying the Seahawks are going to trade with Atlanta. Atlanta's going to move up and get a pass rusher, and that deal is pretty much done. He was saying they were going to go up and move and get Charles Harris. Harris went off the board a little bit earlier than expected, and then ended up taking Tack McKinley instead. But essentially, he called that trade a few days in advance of the actual draft, and it happened on draft day. So if you see someone like that projecting something or saying something, you can pretty much take it on face value. And one of the players that he's been linking the Seahawks to is a guy called Austin Corbett, who was a tackle at Nevada, has had a fantastic season. It was a really good 2017 season. I think that they're not going to play tackle in the NFL. Isaiah Wynn and Austin Corbett are both going to move inside to guard or even center. But they were the two best left tackles in college football last year, better than McGlinchey and Colton Miller for sure, who are both going to be first-round left tackles, but they're going to move inside. Corbett just didn't get beat, and he's got better athleticism than people realize, fantastic character, and Tony Pauline's linking him to the Seahawks. He mocked him to the Seahawks this week. He's often talked about their interest. I spoke to Tony a couple of weeks ago. He said that he's a player that they really like. So I think that is a trustworthy rumor that we can buy into. It doesn't mean they're going to take him with their first pick, but it's certainly a name to keep an eye on when this draft begins this week. So that's one of the rumors there. And there haven't been many other rumors. There haven't been players connected to the Seahawks other than people like, I think Jason Lacanfora has linked Josh Sweat as a possible target for the Seahawks. They've met with him, so that wouldn't be a big surprise. They need a pass rusher as well. But you just sort of look at the sort of names that they've been meeting with or they've invited to the VMAC. I think you've absolutely spot on with what you say about smoke screens. It's often just a way to, if you don't like a player who's been linked to your team, you can just try and reassure yourself by saying it's a smoke screen. But look, the teams like the Seahawks, they're not going to waste VMAC visits on a lot of smoke screens. I think, considering that you're probably only going to pick once in a certain range, if you invite 10 players that are all going to be available in that range to come and meet with you to find out a little bit more about their personality and whether they fit your culture, whether they fit in your building, then you're not really giving anything away, because what are the teams around you going to do? They're going to assume you're going to take one of these 10 players anyway, because all of the teams, their boards have some similarity. Players will be projected to go in a certain range across the board. There's going to be a general consensus there. If you're meeting somebody, for example, like Justin Reed or Ronnie Harrison or Austin Corbett, which is who the Seahawks are met with, or Billy Price, teams are going to know that they're going to go between sort of 30 and 45 anyway. So if you're meeting with them, it's not really giving anything away. And also teams know what each other's needs are. They do projections for all the other teams too. So you're not really, there's no real need to have this veil of secrecy about who you're actually meeting with. And some of the names that they met with, I think, are very interesting. If they traded Earl Thomas, they did meet with Justin Reed and Ronnie Harrison, and both at the VMAC. You see sort of names like Isaiah Oliver, the cornerback, who could be a really interesting player for the Seahawks. Will be the earliest they've taken a corner if they're going to take him in round 2. But then they also have a hedge and bring in Holton Hill as well as somebody who could be sort of a day 3 alternative to Isaiah Oliver. There's a lot of pass rushers coming in. They're looking at players who project to be potential Michael Bennett replacements, like Andrew Brown and Breland Speaks, 2 players that I really like a lot. And looking at edge rushers as well. So you're looking at the likes of Josh Sweat and Kamoko Toure and Dorrance Armstrong too. So I think my opinion has changed from the names that they've been linked with. I think initially a few weeks ago, I was thinking this was all going to be about the running game. They talked a lot about fixing the run. And I thought that their first 2 picks could be offensive line and running back, or blocking tight end, or, those kind of positions there, because that would be the priority, fixing the running game. But as the time has gone on, I've started to think that what they're actually going to do is try and identify where the talent cliffs are. For example, can you get a cornerback in round 5? Yes, we can. Okay, so we won't take one early. We'll take a pass rusher in round 2 or round 3 because they're not going to be available in round 5. It's that kind of approach. And I think what they're going to try and do is get as much talent as much positions as possible to try and create this really big competition going into camp. And that could mean that their first pick could be a receiver, a defensive lineman, could be a guard, could be a running back, could be a tight end, it could be a whole range of different positions there. And I think that's going to make this a very interesting draft, and one we're not going to be able to judge until the very, very end when we see exactly what the Seahawks have done, because I think they're going to try and find some day 3 genuine, legitimate starters this year. They've not done that in a while.
Yeah, that'll be interesting, and we'll get into the Seahawks needs in a minute too. But I was curious as well. This is maybe a tough question, but I'm gonna make it tough. So, let's say that if the Seahawks use pick 18, they don't trade down. If they actually use pick 18, then we know they're not going to do any more work for the rest of day 1. We know they're probably not going to do any work on day 2. And I mean, this is a front office that loves to have things to do on the draft day. So if they use pick 18, it would have to be for someone really special. So I want you to give me 3 names that if they were available on pick 18, and I'm going to give you the first name because you brought it up. So let's say I'm going to give you 3 names that if they were available at pick 18, you would have to hesitate and go, I don't know if I can take a trade right now. I need to take this player. And the first one is Vita Vea. So, if he was available at 18, I know you have him at 13 in your latest mock draft. So it would be a tumble, but it would be a slight tumble. And I want you to give me 2 other names maybe that it would really test you if you were at pick 18, that you might see such a good amount of talent or such a fit for the Seahawks right now that you would actually hesitate and maybe pick that player and know that you're going to spend the next day and a half doing nothing.
Well, I think Vita Vea is probably one of the players that you would have to genuinely have a think about, because for me, he's one of the top 5 or 6 players in the draft. And I think that putting him at 13 is probably the lowest that he's going to go. I think that Washington at 13 is his worst case scenario. I think that Miami at 11 could certainly take him. I think Oakland at 10. Wouldn't be surprised if Chicago took him at 8. Or even Indianapolis thought about bringing him in there. I mean, he's such a good player. I mean, he's just a fantastic player. There just aren't many human beings on the planet like Vita Vea. And, I've seen a lot of mock drafts having him available sort of 17, 18 range, and I just don't see it. But he's one of those players that if the Seahawks brought him in, you plug him in that interior defensive line, and you've got a player for the next 5 or 6 years at least who is going to play at probably a Haloti Ngata type level, the kind of player that you can build around. He is the type of player that would make you second guess trading down, but I really don't see any chance of him making number 18. And if you wanted some other names, I think the only types of player that at number 18 that would make me second guess it are, and this won't happen obviously, is whether or not a Quentin Nelson, for example, fell, or Chubb or Saquon. You know, they're the types of players that I think you just have to say they're too good to pass on. Obviously, none of those players are going to make it to number 18. I think the only other couple of players that would make me second guess it are Tremaine Edmonds, who again is not going to fall to number 18, and Leighton Vander Esch. Now, Vander Esch could make it to 18. There's been some mixed reports. You see some people suggesting there's no concerns with the neck injury that he's had, and you've seen others, including Chris Mortensen, I believe, suggesting that it could be a bit of an issue for some teams. And the Seahawks did actually have Leighton Vander Esch in for a VMAT visit, which is what they did with Morris Hurst as well. And I just wonder if the whole point of that was to get an absolute firm medical check-in, to get their doctors to have a proper look at Leighton Vander Esch and get a full analysis on his injury situation, because you've got to be prepared for if he falls. I mean, what if he was still there at the start of the second round? You see these things with Miles Jack falling, for example. You've got to have all of the information, because if these players start to fall, you've got to be ready to decide whether you're going to make a move or not. So I think that's, you know, he's someone who ordinarily would go in the top 12. I think he's as close to Luke Kuechly physically as you're ever going to get. If you look at his testing numbers, they are very, very similar. And I think he's kind of got that level of potential. I'm not afraid to make that comparison. If he falls to 18, I think you seriously have to consider him. It's just not the biggest need, is it? I mean, you'd be talking about a player that would play possibly Sam linebacker in 2018 and then replace KJ Wright in a year's time. Is that the best use of a first-round pick when you're not going to pick again until round 4 unless you trade Earl Thomas? I'm just not sure that you can make that move. But I think Vita Vea is definitely one of the players you'd consider it for. I'm not sure there are many others.
Yeah, you mentioned Bradley Chubb and Doug Farrar of SI, I think, and he had Bradley Chubb in his mock today at 14 to the Packers, and he, based it on, this is what I would do, and I don't like Chubb as much as other people. Is there anyone for you in that top 5 or top 10 that you see, if it was up to you, they're probably going to go that high, but if it was up to you, they would go much lower?
Yeah, I like him as a player. I think the one name that probably makes me pause a little bit in terms of how high he's been projected is Roquan Smith. And that's not because I don't like Roquan Smith. I think you just have to be honest about what he is. And he does have some flaws. He's not the biggest linebacker. He's not the fastest either. I mean, for a smaller linebacker, you kind of want to see that, 4.4 speed. He hasn't quite got that. And the biggest issue is, and if anybody wants to sort of look back at the Georgia-Oklahoma game from the college football playoffs, and you will see that Oklahoma had this very big offensive line, and what they were targeting Roquan Smith. They were making a point of it. It was a very solid game plan. I'm probably not the first to do it in 2017, but Oklahoma certainly mastered this. Get their big offensive linemen to the second level, latch on to Roquan Smith, and they were creating huge holes in the running game as a consequence. He's not got the length. He can't shed a block. If you get a big offensive lineman on him at the second level, he really, really struggled. And that just makes me worry a little bit. I don't, especially when you're drafting someone like a middle linebacker that early, top 10, top 12, if you've got an obvious flaw like that, and if college teams are exploiting him in that way, it makes me worry about what he's going to be at the next level. Now, if you can keep Roquan Smith clean, if you had, for example, San Francisco's defensive line's very big, and just if you said to the likes of Solomon Thomas and DeForest Buckner and people like that, okay, we just want you to eat up all of the blocks and keep Roquan clean, then that would be perfectly fine. The Seahawks did a very good job of keeping Bobby Wagner clean last year, and you saw what he was able to do. And if you can keep Roquan clean, then he'll fly around, he'll run to the ball, he'll make loads of plays, he'll get, ridiculous number of tackles, and will be a playmaker. But if you haven't got the kind of defensive line that can keep him clean, then he's going to be a liability, and he could give up a lot of big plays in the running game as a consequence. So, for me, I really like Roquan Smith. I don't want this to be seen as me thinking that he's not good. I think that saying that Bradley Chubb should be the number 14 overall pick this year is a bit daft, quite frankly. That's my personal view on that. I don't think Roquan Smith should be like the 35th pick in the draft as a consequence of this. It's the one thing that would give me a little pause for thought, though. In a funny way, if you could get Vita Vea and Roquan Smith in the same draft, then you'd be you'd be in really great shape because you'd have the guy who'd eat up the blocks up front, and the guy that you're keeping clean in the second level can make loads of plays. But unless you've got that type of defensive line who can do that, I think it'd be a little bit of a concern with Roquan Smith, and he is going to be very scheme dependent.
And let's talk about the needs for the Seattle Seahawks right now leading up to the draft. I wrote an article on Field Goals today about the needs, and I kind of approached it from two angles, which was what is their need based on 2018, and then what is their need sort of for the big picture. And I think there's a difference. And, in the article I wrote about the differences between needs and priority. Like your number one priority is not the same as your number one need. If you look at the Seattle Seahawks right now, they need a starting cornerback. There's not even a question about it. Like they don't have, a person who would typically live up to the standard of being a starting cornerback, especially. And we're not talking about comparing him to Richard Sherman. We're just saying like, okay, well, is the reality now that the Seahawks are Dante Johnson and Shaquille Griffin as their starting cornerbacks on the outside? Or Nico Thorpe or DeAndre Elliott or, no, I think that the Seahawks still need a starting cornerback, and that could be Byron Maxwell, even though, again, it would have to be short term and definitely a competition. But, going into the draft, I think a starting cornerback is their number one need. However, their priority could be, look, we're going to get by without that cornerback position because we know that if we have an opportunity to get a great pass rusher, that's our highest priority. Our highest priority is to improve our pass rush. So, it may not be the same as a need, but it's like, hey, we're going to keep getting better at this pass rush thing, long-term, short-term, all that kind of stuff. So I think that's their number one priority. But the needs, hey, they need a starting cornerback. If they had to go out and play tomorrow, I think they would be able to fill all those positions with pretty much whatever they're going to fill in week one. And the only exception is cornerback. Now they could go out and find better players on the offensive line or a better tight end or a better wide receiver, all those kinds of things. But their needs for me lie in, cornerback is something that they need to fill in, but their priority remains pass rush or, more help for Russell Wilson. So Rob, going into the first round or, day three, what do you see as the Seahawks' top most biggest needs or priorities? And what are they going to have the easiest time filling with this draft class?
It's harder this year to say what their absolute biggest need is. It's probably the toughest question to answer since 2010, because I think that even after that first initial draft, they having drafted a Kung and Earl Thomas and got people like Cam Chancellor that they were building around. It still felt like they had a direction in 2011 where they got Marshawn Lynch, and if they could just improve the running game, that they could take a huge step forward, which they eventually did. This year, I think you're talking about, I think you're right with cornerback. I don't know who is to blame on the Byron Maxwell situation, whether it's Byron Maxwell asking for too much money or whether the Seahawks have just been a bit silly and lowballed him a little bit here. I don't know. I think everybody would feel a lot more confident if Maxwell was signed to a new contract right now. Just if you could start, if you played a game of football tomorrow and you had Maxwell and Griffin as your two starting cornerbacks, I don't think people would be panicking. They wouldn't be saying it was a great situation, but I don't think anyone would panic. Whereas if Maxwell's not there is a little bit of cause for concern. So I think you can make a case for that. The defensive line, especially on the edge, the pass rush, huge question marks there. You've basically got Frank Clark, Deion Jordan, who's not played, more than a handful of games in the last few years. You've got Marcus Smith, who played with an injury last year but didn't really show a great deal. There's not too much there, and then you look at fixing the running game, which for me is possibly the most important thing, just because the Seahawks, as their identity, requires a running game, and what was on the field last year was an absolute shambles. To not have a single rushing touchdown in the red zone, to have only one rushing touchdown, that was from J.D. McKissic on a late play against the Colts in a game that was already pretty much tied up. I mean, it was just an appalling situation for a team that has prided itself on the running game for so long. So you've got to find a way to fix that. Whatever way you do it, you've got to do it. So there's many, many different needs there. And I think what ultimately they're going to do in this draft, because there are so many needs, and here's another need. I mean, how many touchdowns have they lost with Jimmy Graham and Paul Richardson moving on? Now, maybe you believe that Ed Dixon's going to replace the 10 touchdowns Jimmy Graham had, or maybe you feel like some of these receivers that you brought in are going to make up for the production that Paul Richardson produced. But that might be a bit of a stretch. You might have to add somebody who can score you 5-6 touchdowns next season just to try and make up for that, because the running game isn't necessarily just going to provide that answer. So I think what you're going to end up having to do is look at the draft, find out where the cliffs are, and as I mentioned before, you need a starting corner. Is Holton Hill someone who can come in and you feel you can coach up and be a starter? Or Tony Brown, for example, at Alabama? Are they players that you believe can come in and start very quickly? And if so, then maybe you don't take Isaiah Oliver in the second round. If it's the other way around, if you've met with Tony Brown, you've met with Holton Hill, if you think, no, they're not for us, we've got to find a cornerback, then maybe you take Isaiah Oliver with your first pick. And that's the way you're going to have to play it. I think there's probably a little bit more depth at corner than there is at edge rush. But then when you look at the edge rush options, are you going to take a chance on Josh Sweat's knee? Are you going to take a chance on Kamoko Torre, he is very, very talented, but in terms of football smarts and whether he's going to be able to pick up a new defense and whether he can stay healthy, big question marks there. So, how early do you take an edge rusher knowing that the options later on aren't going to be very good? At what point, what's the latest point you can take a running back in this very good class, but there will be a cliff at some point where it goes very sharply down. And the receiver position is terrible this year. I mean, there was a quote from a veteran scout, courtesy of Bob McGinn, saying I think he said it was the worst receiver class he'd ever scouted, and that there's no legitimate first-round picks in this class apart from perhaps at a push Calvin Ridley. And if that's the case, and you look at someone like Christian Kirk, for example, and say, okay, he's very reliable and strong and tough, and he's got the high character, and he's perfect for Air Coryell, gets downfield, makes chunk plays, scores touchdowns, great return man. We can get him in the second round, but if we don't get him, then we ain't getting a receiver in this draft. Maybe you feel like you've got to take him early, knowing that you might be able to get a defensive lineman later, or a cornerback later, or a running back later. I mean, that's the way it's going to be. And what I think we'll find, Kenny, is that unless they take a certain position, so let's say offensive line or cornerback, I think what you're going to have is Seahawks Twitter have a meltdown on Friday, probably, when they've traded out the first round, and then take a position. If they took a receiver, for example, took Christian Kirk with that first pick, Seahawks Twitter's going to have a meltdown and say, what on earth are they doing? Why have they taken that pick? Where's the pass rush? Where's the running game fix? Where's the cornerback? But what you're actually going to have to do in this draft is you're just going to have to wait for the whole thing to take place. Because I think they're going to find somebody, and I think they're going to target players in the fifth round that they are targeting specifically because they believe they can be starters. And that is why they haven't taken certain positions early in the draft. And we're going to have to judge the whole class, not just the first pick, not just the second pick. But, if here's me trying to argue that Seahawks fans shouldn't have a knee-jerk reaction to who they pick first, I'm fighting a losing battle there. That's not going to happen. But if anybody's listening to this, what I would say is if they pick a receiver first, for example, or they pick a position that you didn't want them to pick, don't overreact too much, because I think that's going to be part of this plan. It's about finding players that are going to have an impact for this team now. And if that means taking a certain position early because the options are pretty crappy later on, that's just what they're going to have to do to try and max out this draft.
Let's talk about your top six at the positions here. I want to get into some of these bigger draft picture stuff as well. And some of this stuff will relate to the Seahawks. So if you're a Seahawks fan, don't tune out just yet, or do. It's up to you. But let's talk about some of the top six stuff. But specifically, we can start at the quarterback position. And you've got the quarterbacks, everyone's talking about how the top four guys are going to go. And for you go Sam Darnold, Josh Rosen, Baker Mayfield, Josh Allen in your rankings. Not necessarily the order that they will go in, but that's where you have them. And it seems like out of those four guys, or any of the quarterbacks in the draft, Josh Allen is the guy that people are considering to have the highest ceiling, but also it sounds like the lowest percentage shot to actually get there. And I'm just asking, so if Josh Allen is the riskiest, who is the safest? Is there one guy that's going to be? Is Sam Darnold to you the safest, or is he just the biggest combination of ceiling and safety? Where do you stand right now with those four guys?
Yeah, I think that Sam Darnold ultimately is probably the safest pick in terms of just the complete package, in terms of his character, what he's done in college, the way that he improvises well, and when plays break down, he's can be quite good. He's mobile. I think he just ticks a lot of the different boxes there. I don't think that his upside is anywhere near as what Josh Allen's is, but I think that what you'd expect from Sam Darnold, if you were sat there with the number one pick, if you were John Dorsey, for example, and you were saying, okay, what's the optimum I'm going to get from Sam Darnold? I think you're probably saying it's someone like Carson Palmer, but with maybe a little bit more mobility and improvisation. So that's the kind of player that you're looking at there. And then if Cleveland does end up getting someone similar to Carson Palmer, they'll be very happy with that pick if they take Sam Darnold. I think if you could also make a case for it. I mean, Josh Rosen's probably the most natural quarterback of the group, in terms of what he does as a passer. He's probably the most natural pass completer and thrower. I just got natural talent there. But obviously there are maybe a few more character concerns, or in terms of his personality and how he's going to mesh, how is he going to lead a group of men, maybe than Sam Darnold's. No real question marks there. And Baker Mayfield is kind of different. He's a fiery character. Some teams are going to love that competitive spirit in Baker Mayfield, and some are going to want to tell him to shut up and pipe down a little bit. And it's just that's what I think is fascinating about these group of quarterbacks, is that it's really going to come down to personal preference. I could see teams rating Josh Allen as the best player in the draft purely because he has everything physically. The huge hands, the great arm, the mobility. He's the best running quarterback, probably apart from Lamar Jackson in this class. The upside is off the charts. He is a number one overall pick in any draft based on upside. But then you see him on tape for Wyoming, and you don't see enough to sort of invest that faith. He did have a very good Senior Bowl, and maybe that will reassure some teams. And there has been talk that he'll go number one. And I think part of that is because of the reassurance that he provided at the Senior Bowl there. But there is some risk, and that's another thing that a team has to weigh up. If you're Cleveland and you've had all these misses at quarterback, this long, lengthy list of quarterbacks you've tried, and one after another has fallen away. How willing are you to take a risk on someone like Josh Allen versus perhaps the more safer pick in Sam Darnold? And that's might be the kind of debate that they have. But listen, none of these guys are flawless. None of them are going to be graded in the way that Andrew Luck was graded, for example, in 2012. There's a little bit of a question mark for all of them. But I think one thing you have got this year is you've got 5 guys, possibly even more, who have got a legitimate chance to become franchise quarterbacks. You don't often have that many who can do that. So in that sense, it's an exciting draft because there are quarterbacks in this class who could go on to be not just good starters, but really good starters.
And, there's a lot of talk this year and, sometimes in past years, but as always, every organization wonders, and there's talk of, what if they draft a quarterback? Who would be the quarterback in the entire draft that you would say is most likely to be drafted by the Seattle Seahawks, even if it's a small percentage shot, because that is what we're talking about with any prospect, is there's a small percentage. But who do you think is a quarterback that stands out to you because he's Seahawky, would be available in the right area for the Seahawks, and all those considerations?
Well, I think the one that probably stands out in terms of there isn't anybody who I would say ticks every box as a Seahawks type of quarterback, because the one thing that they like completion percentage, they like quarterbacks to be point guard type quarterbacks with a degree of mobility. They like big hands. So there's lots of different things to check off there. Russell Wilson was the complete package apart from the height, which shows that they're willing to take a player who is very, very highly graded, but just doesn't quite have a certain aspect. I think the one that I've kept coming back to for the Seahawks, for no real reason other than the fact he is a great character. He's very gritty. I think he's very accurate. I think that he's the type of character that they want is Luke Falk. And that's not to say that Luke Falk is going to necessarily go on to be a franchise quarterback. I think there's a decent chance he'll end up with the New England Patriots. And I just like him. And there are games for Washington State where he didn't look very good and he got rattled and he had so much pressure in his face at Washington State. But that's the other thing that I like about him, is that on many occasions he delivered an accurate pass, which is a very difficult throw when he was getting smacked in the face. Just a split second before he gets hit, he's delivered an accurate pass. I think there's a lot to like about Luke Falk. And if he was there in round 3, and if the Seahawks had all their native picks and they traded down and they had a few extra picks to spare, I mean, like the last couple of years, for example, they had some like 6 third-round picks. If they had another 3 this year and he was there in the 3rd round, I would be well up for them taking Luke Falk as someone just to bring in, be the backup, see if he can turn into something over time. I think the fact that they've got so many needs and so few picks to fill those needs means they're probably unlikely to spend. I know there's been talk today, they might take Lamar Jackson. Yeah, this is all silliness. They're not going to take them. The Seahawks are not going to pick once at 18, take a quarterback, therefore not addressing any serious need on the team in the first 3 rounds of the draft, and then in round 4 start clapping their hands together going, right, let's get started and rebuilding this roster. I mean, that's just not going to happen. The only way they would take a quarterback with their first pick this year would be as if they traded Russell Wilson, which they haven't done. So I just don't see that as a scenario, and I think it's probably one of the reasons why they've been looking at obviously Kyle Allen, who came in for a visit after a workout as well. I think they probably invited him to be the guy who was throwing the passes to Christian Kirk and Kalen Ballage for that workout. Saw what they liked, invited him to the VMAC, so he's an option there. And Alex McGuff is a player that they've also invited to the VMAC recently as well. And Tony Pauline has mentioned that they've had a good look at him, and he seems to be a smaller school prospect who's getting some momentum in this late stages. So it might be that they go more that direction, take a late round flyer on one of those guys, or bring them in as an undrafted free agent.
And with your running back rankings, we talked about the Seahawks and their issues with running. Hey, look, see, if you stayed tuned in, because I told you Seahawks stuff was coming, you're getting paid off right now. With the running backs, you got your top 6: Saquon Barkley, Ronald Jones, Nick Chubb, Kerryon Johnson, Darius Guicha, and Sony Michel. And so that top 6 for the running backs is obviously a good 6. So let's talk about anyone that's not on those top 6. And I know that you've got, a couple more guys for sure that you've got in the top 75. But give me a name that's not on the top 6 that has the highest probability to be the best running back in the class, because I know it's anyone, yourself included, is going to be hard pressed to say that anyone would be better than Saquon Barkley, and that's fine. And I'm sure that's probably true. But give me someone that's not in that top 6 that has the highest probability to be the best running back in this draft. Rob, I think you may still be muted.
Apologies for that. Yeah, I was. Yeah,
No
the two names that could easily have been in the top 6 that weren't were Royce Freeman and Rashad Penny. So of Oregon and San Diego State, they could easily have been in the top 6. So I think they, if we're talking about players that could end up being, the next Kareem Hunt, for example, that there'd be 2 candidates there. It's a really strong looking running back class, and if Saquon Barkley got injured, or he landed in the wrong spot, whether that happens sometimes. Look at Myles Garrett in Cleveland, for example. If Myles Garrett would have been on a proper team last year, then he could have been Defensive Rookie of the Year, maybe. I mean, it's just sometimes situation matters. So if it didn't work out for Saquon, then that these are the kind of players you'd be looking at there. And listen, I don't want to just be talking about this guy because the Seahawks have shown a bit of interest in him. They've worked him out. I'm going to talk about him in part because of that. But there are some things to like about Kalen Ballage. Now, a couple of years ago, people will remember he scored 8 touchdowns in a game against Texas Tech and set a new record in the NCAA. And it got people talking. And we wrote a piece about him on Seahawks Draft Blog in 2016 saying this is a guy to keep an eye on. He didn't declare for last year's draft and obviously stayed at Arizona State. There are some things to really like about him. He's got everything that a Seahawks running back physically would want. Very explosive. So did very, very well in the broad and the vertical. That has been very important to the Seahawks. Explosion versus speed. It's always explosion with the Seahawks and running backs. He did still run a 4.4 in a 40. He's got the size that they look for. He's 228 pounds, which is fantastic for them. He's 6'1", so he's not too tall. He is quite highly cut, but still a decent size there for the Seahawks, what they look for. And he runs with some aggression. I mean, I could show you a highlights video, which would make him look like he's one of the best running backs that have ever played the game. I mean, he runs through tackles. He drags people for extra yardage. Gets to the outside nicely. Very fluid runner. Excellent pass catcher. Can make loads of plays. He's very much a modern day running back. But there are so many other things though that just sort of dilute everything I've just said there, which is the fact that he never became the distinguished number one running back at Arizona State. Why was that? Why was his performance so inconsistent? Is it just because Arizona State were terrible for the last 2 years, or is there more to it? You know, why is he never, given all of these physical qualities that he's got, why was he not producing the kind of numbers even in one season that Ronald Jones, the second, put up at USC? You know, in a division in the conference that allows for running back production. You know, it's not the Big 12 by any stretch, but it's certainly not the SEC in terms of tough physical defenses. So why wasn't Kalen Ballage more productive? So these are the kind of questions you have to ask. But if there was, I've seen him compared to DeMarco Murray, and people saying that he could be that at the next level. And certainly when DeMarco Murray was at Oklahoma, he was more of a change of pace, pass catching back, didn't have the big production, wasn't just a run it up the gut type of player. He was drafted in the 3rd round by Dallas and ended up becoming that tremendous physical running back who was very difficult to stop. Yes, playing behind a great offensive line, but still was the leading NFL rusher. So for a period there. So I don't think that's an invalid comparison. I'm not saying that he is going to be DeMarco Murray. I'm saying that if people want to suggest that, then it's not completely wide of the mark. And if the Seahawks are going to do the whole Cliff thing of when the latest we can take a running back, it wouldn't surprise me if they look at the running backs in this class and say Ronald Jones II's undersized, Nick Chubb's had the knee injury, Kerryon Johnson gets banged up and is very upright as a runner and gets a lot of hits. Darius Geis has got character concerns and is a bit too much like Thomas Rawls. Sony Michel fumbles the ball too much. Royce Freeman's a big back that plays like a small back, and Rashad Penny's competition level there's a question mark there. And is he actually that special, or is he just a decent running back? And if they do all of that, they might conclude that Kalen Ballage is the best bet, that he's someone they can get in the 3rd round or 4th round and could end up actually being one of the better running backs in this class. I'm not saying it's going to happen. It's not saying that it'd be my plan to fix the running game, but it could happen. And the fact that they worked him out with Christian Kirk, I think is quite interesting.
And just glossing over some of these other top 6s and ranking them and sort of I'm going to punch them together and come up with an overarching question. I don't know why I need to explain the process that's going through my head right now, but just looking at some of these other guys, and I see in some of your top 6s things that for me, even as a cursory follower of the draft, I'm like, oh, I've not seen anyone ranked that high or that low. That seems high or that seems low. Wide receiver Anthony Miller, you've got number 1, but not going in your first 2 rounds of the mock draft. And, you know, it seems to me could be with his pro day, get into that 2nd round, maybe, or into the 3rd round or something like that. But number 1 seems very high, and that seems like a really high one. Ian Thomas, number 1 tight end. I think Will Hernandez is someone that you've got at 7 for guard center, and that seems low compared to some of the other things I've seen. Can you talk about the guys that you see out there that are either going to go too high or too low, even perhaps by 1 or 2 or 3 rounds?
Yeah, I mean, firstly on Anthony Miller, I when I did my first mock draft, I think I put him in the top 20. I think I put him to Green Bay and felt that he was the best receiver in the draft. And I've not seen anything since that would suggest otherwise. I don't think he's going to be the first receiver taken by any stretch. He could even last into the 3rd round. There are a few injury concerns there, and he didn't have a fantastic workout. But in terms of the ability to get open, it's just a really gritty play, just a really competitive. Of all the players in this draft, he might be one of the top 5 most competitive. And I just love the way that he plays. When you watch him, I'm not saying that he is Odell Beckham. You kind of see some of that I would say acceptable arrogance that comes from Anthony Miller, and I just really like him as a player. So I had no issue at all putting him at number 1 on the receiver list. And because I think he's the best receiver in the draft, doesn't mean that I think he's going to go in the first 2 rounds. So that's why he wasn't in the first 2 of the mock draft. I think Ian Thomas is a player who might not be the best rookie tight end, but I think 2 or 3 years down the line could be the best tight end from this draft, from this what I think is a pretty mediocre tight end draft class this year. And then with Will Hernandez, I just think that the guard center group there are 2 real strengths of the draft early on, and that is running back and it is interior offensive line. And Will Hernandez being number 7 is not so much a review of Will Hernandez as it is a review of the guys in front of him. I think Isaiah Wynn could be a Zach Martin level player. I just think he's just a fantastic player. I've got him at number 2. Austin Corbett, for me, is fantastic. Really, really warrants a place in the first round. I personally don't think that drafting another guard early, given what they've invested in the offensive line already, is the best way to go. But if they took Austin Corbett with their first pick, I'd really struggle to complain about that, because he's just such a good player. Love Billy Price, love Frank Ragnow, love James Daniels. From what I've not watched him as much as the others, but I just see a real fantastic athlete at center there. And then you've got Will Hernandez, who I think is really good, but I think he is what he is, which is a very big, tested better and performed better at the combine than I expected. I think he had something like a very low Wonderlic score, which is not always the big indicator, but I think that maybe he might take a bit of time to learn a new scheme. Perhaps that's sometimes indicative of that. Whether or not he's going to be dominating players at the next level the way that he perhaps did at college when he faces bigger defensive linemen, we'll have to wait and see on that. But I think he's a really good player and warrants a place in the top 35. I just think that so do James Daniels, Frank Ragnow, Billy Price, Austin Corbett, and Isaiah Wynn. And I really like Braden Smith, who's behind him as well at number 8. I think that Braden Smith's a bit of an underrated player. Was the most explosive tester that we've done since we started doing this thing, with his performance at the combine. And I think he's also a player who, if he goes in the second round, someone's going to get a real steal.
And with the rest of the sort of the first round and just wrapping up some of the general talk about what's going on, any inclination for big surprises, things to sort of, we have every single year, every draft lives on its own and it's its own beast. And we can always remember that draft as its own sort of, just if it had a theme, or if it just was a moment, or lots of trades, inactivity, Aaron Rodgers slipping, like anything. We always get these. Every draft has its own sort of. You just remember it like an episode of a TV show. And with this coming up 2018 class, we don't know what's going to happen. But whether it's like, say, Josh Allen not going in the first round, or someone that you see like going, hey, how did that guy go in the top 10? No one was talking about him 6 hours ago, and now he's in the top 10. And anything that you're seeing in terms of how this draft will be thematically, or surprises, or anything else to look forward to, since we are just a few days away.
Well, I think some of the surprising things that could happen, I feel like we've talked about them so much across the draft season, whether it's on the blog or in the podcast, that I'm not sure whether people listening to this will find them particularly surprising, but I think that the draft media would find them surprising. And I think that's that Minkah Fitzpatrick, I don't think he's going to go as early. I mean, you had people projecting Minkah Fitzpatrick to go 4th overall just a few weeks ago, and I think he's probably more likely to go 14th overall than 4th overall. I've never quite understood why he's been this consensus really high top 5 pick at any point in this process. I haven't seen it either as a tester or what you see on tape. I'm not sure why he's been given that lofty review. And I think that the national types have come round to this now and seem to be projecting him to go between 10 and 15. And that's where I think he's going to go. I never thought he was a top 5. And I think that there will still be some people who go, wow, he fell to 14 at Green Bay. What a shock. But I wouldn't find that particularly surprising. And I won't find it surprising if Derwin James lasts a bit longer. I mean, you see people projecting him to go number 7 to Tampa Bay. I think that'd be a real surprise if he went as early as number 7 to Tampa Bay. I think he'd be more likely to go to number 17 to the LA Chargers, because as athletic as he is, put on the tape, he's great as a box safety. He's a really athletic box safety, but that just the value isn't really there for that position. So, I'd be a little bit surprised if he went in the top 10. I think Vita Vea is going to go early. I think one thing, Kenny, that I'm most looking forward to finding out is, I think last year kind of set the stall for this. We saw teams making really bold, aggressive moves to get their quarterback, and most of them paid off. So Houston moving up for Deshaun Watson, other teams will have noticed how that paid off for the Texans. I mean, the excitement that he generated before hurting his knee, and Patrick Mahomes as well. Teams look at Kansas City and say, they took him a year too early rather than a year too late. They made the move and they still had Alex Smith. They were still relatively competitive in 2017. They've now got the future of their franchise on the roster. I mean, like, what an opportunity for teams to sort of follow suit, especially if you've got an aging quarterback. So would someone like the LA Chargers, for example, make that kind of... I think there's a really good chance that the Chargers are going to move into the top 10 and do exactly what the Chiefs did with Alex Smith and say, okay, Philip Rivers might have a year, 2 years left with us as the starting quarterback. Let's go and get our quarterback now in a really good quarterback draft, because next year, who's going to be out there? You talk about people like Drew Lock at Missouri, who probably would have been the 5th or 6th quarterback in this draft class. Why are you going to wait till next year to go and make your move? Go and do it this year. So the Chargers could be aggressive. Baltimore could be aggressive. They might go up and get a quarterback to eventually replace Joe Flacco. Arizona needs a quarterback. They might move up. You've obviously got Buffalo in there, Miami. There's all these teams in those from like 11 all the way through to 17 who could be ready to move up and go and get a quarterback. And that for me is going to be the most interesting thing, is to find out where these quarterbacks go, because it's a given that Cleveland's going to take one, and it's a given that the New York Jets are going to take one. There are other teams in that sort of early few picks that there's a chance they could take one, whether it's the Giants at number 2, Denver at number 5. They could be in the market for a quarterback. But I'm looking at the Miamis, the Buffaloes, Arizona, Baltimore, the Chargers, and thinking, who's going to make the move? Who's going to be bold? Who's going to go up and get Josh Rosen? Who's going to go up and get Josh Allen? Who's going to be the one who really, really goes after this? Because I think the precedent was set last year for these big, bold trades, and I think we're going to see it again this year.
And finally, for wrapping up sort of the Seahawks, this is a pre-wrap. Then we're going to wrap. But you've got the Seahawks in your latest mock draft, moving down from 18 to 33 in a trade with the Cleveland Browns, and then moving down from 33 to 38 with a trade with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, where they select Christian Kirk. So you've got Christian Kirk, wide receiver for Texas A&M, as their top pick. But as we've seen in previous drafts with the Seahawks, they trade down. They pick up some extra picks. And at the end of the day, it seems to me like a lot of fans, it's not so much about the fact that they've got these extra picks. Sometimes they just look back at that first pick and they go, well, I don't like that guy enough, so that I don't like what you've done. And sometimes they'll trade down and they'll bypass guys that turn out to be really good. And then people get even more upset, and they're still like maybe ignoring the fact that the Seahawks added extra picks, and maybe the Seahawks didn't make the right decision. I'm not saying that they did, to say pass on a Joel Bitonio or to pass on the tackle from Jacksonville, Cam Robinson, I know, or Ryan Ramczyk with the Saints. There's always going to be guys that they think about, well, you passed over this guy maybe. If it doesn't work out perfectly, they won't think about the extra picks. They'll just think about the guys that you passed over. So in the Seahawks, in this scenario, and we all believe that the Seahawks will probably trade down, but in this scenario where they basically trade out of half of a round, they do trade out of half of a round in their move with the Browns, and then a little bit more. But in that trade with the Browns, you've got them passing on in your mock draft, Colton Miller, Calvin Ridley, Deron Payne, James Daniels, Marcus Davenport, Rashaan Evans, Joshua Jackson, Sam Hubbard, Taven Bryan, Jair Alexander, Jesse Bates, Justin Reed, Isaiah Wynn, Will Hernandez, and Sony Michel. So just in that second half of the first round, what would be the name or the two names that you're like, yeah, I think they'll move down, or I think they should move down, or whatever. But the names in that 15, 16 names that I've just listed that may be like, yeah, it's going to hurt that they didn't get that guy. But, this is what I think they could trade down.
Well, from the names that you've kind of mentioned, I mean, the ones that I personally like the most are people like Isaiah Wynn. They're the ones that I would be sort of banging the table for personally. And I really like Rashaan Evans. Whether he's the kind of player the Seahawks need right now in the first round, I don't think they do. They've spent a lot of money on Justin Britt and brought in Ethan Posick. So you guys like James Daniels, I'm not sure whether that's the direction you need to go. And I'm not that envious of people like, if people take Sam Hubbard, for example, Taven Bryan, I like. Again, just not quite sure whether he's the one for the Seahawks right now. They've not traded Earl Thomas, so people like Jesse Bates III and Justin Reed, again, not feeling particularly bad about that. And there isn't really anybody. I mean, you know, I just feel like, again, that this is a draft class where, you know, and I get it, you know, that I've read fans talking about this. I've read writers and bloggers talking about this. I definitely get the sense there's a feeling among Seahawks fans that they've had enough of trading down, that for them, staying at 18 and taking a pick is what they want to happen now, because they've seen the Seahawks trade down, not have a great deal of success here. They don't want to do that again. They just want to get, you know, I've seen so often people say, just get a blue chip player. But the problem with that is that assumes that there's going to be one there at 18. And look, in previous drafts, when there's been about 20, 25 legit first round picks, that would have been a perfectly plausible argument to make, especially if they had the second and third round picks intact, which they don't this year. But this year, the guy at 18 and the guy at 25 and the guy at 35 are going to be graded really similarly. You know, I was putting together a piece this week, which I'm going to publish before the draft, which is tiered prospects. You know, they're kind of breaking down. Here's the first tier, and it's got people like Saquon Barkley and Quentin Nelson and Tremaine Edmonds and Bradley Chubb and Vita Vea in it. And then you've got the quarterbacks. So you've got your Sam Darnold, your Josh Rosen, your Baker Mayfield, people like that in your sort of second group there that I think come behind the top non-quarterbacks. And then you've got kind of like a third tier for me, which has got about 6 or 7 names on it. And then you've probably just got a tier with about 40 names on it, which is, and there's a paper's width between the quality of the guy at the top and the guy at the bottom. And that's the problem this year, that at 18, you know, at 13, you get a Vita Vea maybe. At 18, you don't. And that's going to be the problem. You might as well trade down from 18 to number 33 and get Cleveland 64 and pick at 33 and 64, because the player at 33 and 64 might be graded the same as the guy at 18, but you've got 2 of them instead of 1. And that's just the thing, is that if you go into a draft class with preconceived ideas on what you would do without actually looking at the players available, that's how you get into mistakes. And if you say, I'm never going to trade down, and then you come up to a class which is tailor-made to trade down, but you're not going to do it because that's your preconceived idea, that's when you're going to get yourself into trouble. I'd be well up for the Seahawks taking, if like we were talking earlier about Vita Vea, if you told me right now that Vita Vea was at number 18, I would have to have a serious think about what I was going to do. You'd have to look at the trade down options, whether you could trade down again, whether you could still get those multiple picks in the second round. But if there wasn't a really tempting offer to move down, I would be jumping all over taking Vita Vea at 18, because he's such a good player. I don't think he's going to be there, but I would. If he isn't there, and you're looking at the options like Harold Landry, for example, and people like that, then I'm trading down, because I'm sorry, but the quality just isn't there to warrant staying put and not picking again to the 4th round. So, you know, that's how I would view this class.
And I had one more. Oh, yeah, I know what it is. All right. Hey, and we're back. Have I been a little off this podcast? Maybe. Will anyone notice? Probably. You know, Rob, right here wrapping up the 3000 NFL mock draft. This is the end of it. So your final thoughts, I'm curious, what would be your ideal way, you know, ideally for you, Rob, Friday night, day 2 is over. What has happened with the Seattle Seahawks? Have they traded Earl Thomas? Have they traded Russell Wilson? Have they stayed at 18 and picked someone? Well, what's your ideal at the end of day 2? I hope the Seahawks have done this, or that they won't do this.
Well, I hope that they found a really good trade deal. And, you know, Tony Pauline's mock draft, again, I'll reference it for a third time. He had a trade down where the Seahawks moved from 18 to 40 with Denver, got Denver's 3rd round pick, which is an early 3rd round pick, which was 96, and got a 2019 first rounder. And I think that'd be a really, really cool deal to do there, because you've got the extra first rounder next year. Denver were terrible in 2017. I think Vance Joseph as a head coach is a little bit out of his depth. They could be terrible again next season. I'm not sure that Case Keenum's going to make them take a big jump there. You could end up with a top 10 pick off Denver and whatever your pick is as well, to really sort of bolster this franchise and move it forward again in the way that you did in 2010 with those 2 first round picks. Funnily enough, courtesy of Denver again in that, you know, they got the 2nd first round pick through Denver there as well, which led to Earl Thomas. So like that kind of a deal, first of all, get a good trade down. That would be my first priority. Personally, what I would like to see is that, you know, my favorite players are people like Isaiah Wynn, Austin Corbett, Ronald Jones II, Nick Chubb, Kerryon Johnson. I'd love to see a couple of those players drafted. I don't think they're going to do that. I think they're going to look at a different direction. I think that you're going to see people like Christian Kirk targeted. I think Corbett could be one of the players they look at. Billy Price. I think they're going to look at defensive line early because they've got to find some pass rushers there. They've got to try and find some solution up front because at the moment the options just aren't there. With Benson Mayowa signing with Arizona, there's not a great deal in terms of free agents out there either to try and get guys in. And I think they're going to go in a different direction. I would not be surprised at all to see him take Christian Kirk and Kalen Ballage. I thought it was very interesting that Pete Carroll and John Schneider worked both of them out a private workout in Arizona. It just seemed to me like a bit of a telltale there. And if they wanted to get both of those players, they could probably quite easily manufacture that to trade down and make sure they could get both of those guys, which could be a possibility there. And I think most of all, just be a bit smarter in this draft. Don't take any big gambles early on. Wasn't a big fan of Malik McDowell before the draft last year. As you know, Kenny, we talked about him, was willing to accept it afterwards and look at the positive side of that. But in hindsight, wasn't a big surprise that he did not end up having an impact for the Seahawks, whatever the means were. He's not been able to do that, and he may never play, sadly, again, as a consequence of what happened there. It's a very sad story, but just try and bring in guys that you're going to be able to rely on. And they did that with Russell Okung, and they did that with Earl Thomas, and they did that with Bobby Wagner, and they did that with Russell Wilson. I'd like to see some of those, high character, all football, dedicated, strong, reliable, tough players coming in here. And I think this is a good draft class for that. And that is what I would like to see. I've got my own favorites. I don't think the Seahawks are going to take them this year. I think they're going to go in a different direction. But I just want to see strong competition. I think it's going to be a really deep class. At least 10 names coming out of this draft class for this year. It's got 8 picks at the moment. I think we'll see at least 10. I think we're going to see a really interesting group of undrafted free agents come in. And then I'll be looking forward to training camp to see them all compete, because that is going to be the theme of this year's training camp. It's going to be open competition at pretty much every spot, unless you're called Russell Wilson, Bobby Wagner, Dwayne Brown, Doug Baldwin, and maybe 1 or 2 others. Apart from that, it's going to be open across the board, and I'm looking forward to that.
Well, me too. And there you have it. This has been 3000 NFL Mock Draft. You can follow Rob on Twitter at Rob Staton, and go to SeahawksDraftBlog.com. Still, in my opinion, of course, the best Seahawks draft writer out there on the business, and very happy to have you here on 3000 NFL Mock Draft yearly. And we'll see what happens in terms of this Thursday when we're doing the Thursday, April 26, 2018, perhaps first round podcast at some point, maybe during, after. We have to see what the Seahawks do. Of course, they are not the easiest team to cover on the day of the draft, especially thinking that they'll probably wait until Friday to actually make any sort of picks. So this has been 3000 NFL Mock Draft. We'll be back Thursday, probably. At least I will, and we'll see if Rob is available on draft day, and then we'll come back on Friday and certainly wrap up some of the Seahawks picks that they've made by that point, whether it's 1 or 2 or none. So most of I guess what I'm saying is most of the good podcasting will come on Saturday after they've actually made 6 or 7 picks. So but that's been it for this episode of 3000 NFL Mock Draft. Stay tuned next time for literally a brand new draft.